this year's Menno Simons lectures. Our speaker this evening is Perry Bush, who is professor at Bluffton University in Bluffton, Ohio. And as many of you know, he has written widely on U.S. Mennonites in the 20th century. And this evening he's going to conclude his series helping us think about some of the context that has brought U.S. Mennonites more into U.S. society. And one of the things I have really appreciated about what we've heard so far is to think a little more broadly than Kansas, to think about Mennonites on a national scale, and to think about the many connections between Bluffton and Bethel and how those work together. And so that is something we don't hear about here very often, and so I very much appreciated that. I ask you now to join me in welcoming Perry Bush.
Good evening. I think I fixed the mic problems tonight, you all, so we'll see. I hope if you can't hear me, then what's the point of these lectures, right? And at least what's my point? Listen, I'm glad to be back, and before anything else, I want to thank the nominating committee for having me here. This is a huge honor. I will admit that, you look at the people who've gone before me in this role, Gail Gerber-Kuntz and John Howard Yoder and Roland Bainton and Martin Marty, and I'm just not in that league, so I'm grateful to be here. And I want to thank John Thiessen and others of the nominating committee for inviting me. I want to thank all the people who've hosted me. I've just gone from one lovely meal and session with faculty and families to another, and it's been, for me, and I hope for you, it's been a marvelously enriching and rewarding couple of days. So I want to thank you all. This has been great for me. 3 midterms have come in Bluffton in my absence, so for me it's back to the trenches as of tomorrow night. I'll just have one more evening here. As we return to this interesting matter of Mennonites and the common good, I want to return briefly to where I began these 3 lectures last night, with this massive gap of income inequality that has steadily widened to Grand Canyon dimensions since about 1973 in our country. Economists and sociologists have produced a wide number of explanations of why this gap has occurred. These range from deep-seated changes in the national and global economy to technological shifts that facilitated the outsourcing of jobs, to demographic shifts emanating from the new immigration, to the educational deficiencies of the American working class. Yet one key cause for the growing income gap, without a doubt, seems to be the growing weakness of unions. For decades, the solid wages paid to the nation's manufacturing workers, made possible in part by union power, served as a basic prop to more widespread economic prosperity. From its apex in 1953, however, organized labor has entered in this country into a long and steady decline. Unionized workers now make up about 13% of the entire American workforce, and that's only 9% in the private sector. This is a level of, and this puts us really at the bottom as a country in terms of all the industrialized countries in the world. I mean, we really have reached the bottom. Now, Mennonites are not immune from these fundamental underlying shifts in the American economy. To a large degree, though not entirely, we have benefited from them, partly because of the way that Mennonites have gravitated towards the helping professions and away from blue-collar occupations. Church sociologists, and we've had a boatload of talented sociologists in the Mennonite Church, they tell us that increasing numbers of Mennonites have achieved higher levels of education, and as a result, they've been able to locate themselves in increasing numbers in the American middle class and in professional occupations to a much higher extent than other American Protestants, and certainly much higher than American society as a whole. Not that these economic buffers have entirely sheltered us from the negative effects of the growing economic divide. In one of the few pieces ever published by an economist in the Mennonite Quarterly Review, in 1979, Jim Harder, one of your folks here, Jim Harder traced the impact of decades of wage stagnation on on Mennonite institutions of higher education. Future president in training there. And in contrast to 2 preceding decades of economic boom, when our colleges received a lot more smaller gifts from a large pool of comfortable but not wealthy givers, since the early 1970s, Jim found, these institutions, Mennonite institutions of higher education, have come to rely on a smaller number of larger gifts from very wealthy donors, which may reflect, he suggested, the increasingly straitened economic circumstances of the Mennonite middle class. Now, Harder's evidence, I mean, this is not put down of a guy who's not my president, but his evidence is thin only because Mennonites haven't paid much attention to these matters, either among themselves or others. One looks in vain for much analysis of class relations or economic justice in Mennonite publications. In the extensive bibliography put together by Willard Swartley and Cornelius Stick of Mennonite writing on peace and social concerns, social class does not even appear as a category. Neither did it materialize in Urbane Peachy's compilation of Mennonite statements on peace and justice, nor in Irvin Stutzman's work, ironically entitled From Non-Resistance to Justice, nor did it appear in Leo Dridger and Donald Crable's analysis of Mennonite peacemaking. Now, these people are all very capable scholars, but they took their cues from the church, and they didn't pay a lot of attention to an issue that the church didn't pay much attention to. The only major exception to a Mennonite focus, a lack of attention to class relations, has been a focus on unions. And throughout most of their history, that focus has been distant at best and sometimes hostile. Union membership traditionally seemed to run up against the biblical prescription of the unequal yoke, and the economic coercion inherent in a strike seemed also to violate traditional Mennonite teaching of non-resistance. And this is understandable. In the early 20th century, when unions first began to appear on Mennonite radar screens, Mennonites were a conservative rural people, many of them heavily influenced by the outside import of Protestant fundamentalism, and nearly all of them heavily shaped by the small town business and farm communities where they lived. So it's understandable why they would not have responded favorably to industrial labor. Even so, I think the Mennonite response to the challenge of organized labor is worth visiting again. And as a way of exploring the pitfalls and potentialities of the Mennonite encounter with unions in the 20th century US, I want to take as a point of comparison the historical journey of an allied activist in a sister church, the Brethren leader Kermit. He's a pivotal figure. He worked closely at one point with the key Mennonite leader on labor issues. He worked closely with Guy Hershberger. But he also mounted, I think, a direct challenge to Hershberger's classic restatement of Mennonite non-resistance, which is, of course, the ethical construct he put together for his church as they began to confront the world and its needs, right about the time of the Second World War. Eby was what a combination. He was a Brethren pastor, and he was an educator. He was also a UAW official. He was a union activist. And he raised all sorts of issues that Mennonites at the time and today might consider: the responsibility for social justice, for example, or the thorny intellectual difficulties involved with political and economic power, and the extent to which peace Christians should sully themselves in the world of politics with all its attendant compromises. In other words, as a way of capping off these lectures, I want to sift through, again, something of Hershberger's ethical system and Eby's challenge to it as a way of exploring, once again, the Mennonite contribution, real and potential, to the common good. So first, we need some background. I actually left on the cutting room floor a little survey through Brethren history. I don't want to go over my time, right? I want to leave time for questions. I was struck. There's not been a lot of historical comparative work done on Mennonites and Brethren, even though there's this wonderful institute at Elizabethtown College that does that stuff. Jim Junke's done some comparative work. They share a lot of similarities. Brethren and Mennonite congregations tend to be physically located near each other. Are there Brethren here? Yeah, sure. McPherson College, sure. And they're in Harrisonburg. They're in Northwest Ohio. They're near us Mennonites. And they had a real parallel engagement on issues of labor and economic justice in the 20th century. And so I don't have time to do much more with the Brethren except that. I do at least want to talk about one key development they both responded to, and that is the rise of industrial labor. Industrial unions arose in the 1930s because they were necessary. That's why we had them. Without unions, workers had no power to counter that of management. Without power, they faced workplace conditions, as I talked about last night, that could be brutal, dangerous, and dehumanizing. Once workers walked through the plant gates, they immediately lost any of the rights of citizenship, assembly, freedom of speech, democratic participation that they enjoyed outside the plant gates. Job foremen possessed a nearly unlimited power to hire and fire at will. And in a time like the 1930s, of massive unemployment, those were life and death decisions. Inside the plant, the speed up of the assembly line pushed workers commonly to the edge of human exhaustion. You could drop over dead when labor remembered, and they wouldn't stop the line. And in response to such conditions, in the middle 1930s, workers finally began to organize on an industrial basis through a new organizing vehicle. They left the American Federation of Labor in large numbers and led by people like John Lewis. Some of us know this story. They organized unions on an industrial basis as opposed to a craft basis, and they called their new outfit the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO. Management responded with blacklisting, paid informers, and then paid thugs to disrupt this organizing. Union workers responded with what means were available to them, and the nation was swept in the 1930s by increasingly large, militant, and oftentimes violent strikes. In contrast to the 1930s, however, but in contrast to the common fate of strikes before the 30s, this time organized labor would meet a different response, largely because of their political power. It didn't take a presidential Einstein to figure out that these workers could vote. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt, as I talked about last night, in the end responded by embracing the cause of organized labor with the Wagner Act, and labor rewarded Roosevelt with their votes. By 1936, blue-collar votes swung solidly behind FDR, and labor votes became a key constituent element of the New Deal political coalition that ushered in about 3 decades of Democratic Party dominance of national politics. And again, labor seized on that opening. In the single year 1937, almost 5 million Americans took part in some kind of strike that year. Almost 3 million joined a union in 1937. And thus the foundation was laid for 3 decades of sustained U.S. economic growth that followed the Second World War. Life expectancy increased, real wages doubled between 1940 and 1967, and during the 1960s alone, the economy grew at an average of 4.1% a year. And again, I don't want to oversimplify these decades of economic boom had a number of interrelated contributing factors. But many economists suggest that a major cause of this economic boom was the power of unions, which assured that working Americans would receive a fair share of it. The power of labor. Well, Brethren and Mennonites rode that upward economic escalator along with everyone else. And we benefited from it. And I think you all in your own life courses could remember the increased economic abundance available to your parents and grandparents, even in places like the rural southern plains. Yet one could only imagine how these decades of industrial strife would have appeared to peace-loving Christians located mostly on small farms or small town businesses. At the end of World War I, as the nation shook to another great wave of strikes, one journalist simply told his readers that, quote, "the greatest of all wars between organized labor and capital seems to have begun." William Jennings Bryan, the great fundamentalist populist hero, told Americans that this would be, quote, "a war of extermination." And imagine how those kind of analyses hit home among small-town Brethren and Mennonites. And it's in this context, it's no wonder that Brethren and Mennonites initially responded to unions as they did. At the 1904 annual meeting of the German Baptist Brethren, which is the forerunner of today's Church of the Brethren, they ruled that unions, quote, "since unions, quote, so often lead to violence and are so often, quote, contrary to the spirit and teaching of Jesus Christ, members were prohibited from joining them." And that prescription was lifted in 1912, but as late as 1941, the Brethren Church allowed union membership only with hesitancy, and more conservative and old order Brethren groups kept that prohibition. The Mennonite response to unions is not as easily summarized. MC Mennonites worked at it most carefully, and after about 1937, they placed that problem squarely in the hands of Guy Hershberger, professor of history at Goshen. And this is someone I've already spent a good deal of time with in these lectures. Hershberger was, of course, a major shaper of Mennonite thinking on social ethics in the 20th century U.S., and in his definitive constructions of Mennonite non-resistance, he laid out a profoundly influential answer for how his church might answer the problem of social injustice. And again, to reiterate from last night, it was epitomized in his model of a socially engaged alternative community where, again, still in line with two-kingdom theology, Mennonites would simply simply do but not demand justice. That's what we do. We do justice. We simply deliver it in word and deed. We would not take on explicit responsibility for social injustice. Words like responsibility and relevance rubbed Hershberger the wrong way. They were dangerous and discomforting words. They sounded altogether too Niebuhrian. Instead, Mennonites would retreat, ideally, to their rural communities where they would simply deliver justice in word and deed in accordance with the ethics of their own kingdom. There's the classic Hershberger formulation. Now, in those communities, Mennonites, said Hershberger, and with the larger Committee on Industrial Relations of the Mennonite Church, Mennonites could not join unions, but it was clear also they could not avoid them. And perhaps the first and clearest recognition of these dynamics appeared in 1938 at a paper Hershberger delivered at a Mennonite Church Conference on Applied Non-Resistance in 1938, and was published right afterwards in the Mennonite Quarterly Review, called Non-Resistance and Industrial Conflict. And again, you read Hershberger's work in these years, and you have to acknowledge, I'm struck by his historical scope, the way he carefully contextualized the labor struggle for his church, his interest in carving out a middle way for his church between management and labor. He was sympathetic to workers. He understood why they were doing what they were doing. He detailed the growing dominance of what he called the, quote, great impersonal soulless corporation, and also the rise of the CIO in response. He told his fellow MC Mennonites, again, he's speaking at this point to a very conservative church with a profound active fundamentalist wing that was continually giving subtle hints it might split away, located primarily in the Shenandoah Valley and in Lancaster, that he told them that the demands of labor, quote, were not unreasonable, all right? Though this was not the case in 38, he said the CIO was aiming for, quote, a position of dominance. And most importantly of all, he wrote in clear recognition how, given the pace of acculturation, how these developments were now ensnaring many Mennonites. Quote, it may be said that the non-resistant churches in America are facing the challenge of industrial labor and challenge of industrial conflict in a really serious way for the first time. Many of our Mennonite people are now in the cities and do not find it easy to return to the farm, unquote. I mean, it's facing us. Our young people are getting jobs in industrial factories, so what should we do? Well, it's clear to Hershberger what Mennonites could not do. They could not take sides nor take part in the industrial struggle. They couldn't do it. That it was, he said, quote, a fight for power with which to achieve social injustice, whereas biblical non-resistance enjoined submission even to injustice rather than engage in conflict, unquote. Nor, he said, could Mennonites engage in campaigns of nonviolent coercion because that was still coercive and its aim was to, quote, humiliate the enemy. So what do we do? He just had a couple of ideas what us Mennonites should do there in 1938 in the industrial struggle. The best way, he says, is to, of course, stay on the farm and don't leave the farm. But he admitted that that's a long-term solution, and it's going to require the development of new large-scale financial resources like Mennonite Mutual Aid. And of course, Mennonite Mutual Aid was born after the war as part of this effort to help young men and women return to the farm. But in the interim, for Mennonites caught up in the industrial struggle, he pointed to an agreement that Mennonites in the Pittsburgh area had worked out with United Mine Workers and allowed them to technically stay out of unions as long as they did not obstruct union organizing activities. They would not pay union dues. No, we don't pay union dues, all right? But they did give money, and they had to get a certain amount of money deducted from their paychecks, which then ended up in union treasuries, okay? But there's not union dues. And look, he admitted the system wasn't perfect, he said, but it's just the best we can get at the time, right? And you go from that logic to CPS, right, and the frozen fund of the CPS workers, and it's the same kind of deals. You can't It's a pragmatic concession to reality. Well, that, he said, had promise, and that's the exact kind of arrangement that Mennonite churches worked out in regards to unions. And for about 2 decades, Hershberger roughly was in charge. The MC Church passed 2 resolutions, one in 1937, the other a tougher one in 1941, again, because of union pressure, because Mennonites were getting increasingly involved in the industrial struggle. And it condemned Mennonite participation in unions because of the biblical prescriptions against the unequal yoke. It reiterated Mennonite neutrality in the industrial struggle, and it forbade members from union membership. You can't join unions. That became a membership issue. And the church installed Hershberger at the head of a committee ultimately called the Committee on Economic and Social Concerns of the Mennonite Church USA, and it empowered him to hash out individual agreements with unions in localities across the country wherever Mennonite employees faced organizing drives. And look, I went over spring break. One of the things I love about these lectures is they asked me, just don't come here and rehash your stuff. We don't want to hear your greatest hits album. Could you give us new research? And so I spent time up in the archives at Goshen reading through Committee on Economics and Social Concerns papers. And, there are boxes and boxes of these things. And he spent hundreds and hundreds of hours traveling all over negotiating deals with individual unions. And he loved it. I mean, it hit his soul, according to Theron Schlaubbach. It provided an opportunity to create kind of a conscientious objection in the field of labor relations and to counter Reinhold Niebuhr's charge of Mennonite withdrawal. This isn't withdrawal. And best of all, says Theron Schlaubbach, it furnished Hershberger another opportunity to, quote, exercise his lifetime genius for taking ethical thought right to where church members live day to day. And I think Theron's right. Absolutely it did. And he spent lots and lots of time. Not that he was always successful, nor were the arrangements perfect. Some unions, like the United Auto Workers, were more cooperative than others, like the Teamsters. Individual Mennonites sometimes violated their professed neutrality by voting against unions in elections or crossing picket lines. They did that more than the other, actually. Moreover, Hershberger and his committee could not always guarantee that the Mennonite, quote, checkoff funds ended up in charitable consequences, where they were supposed to end up, and as they hoped they would end up, instead of union treasuries. In the end, Hershberger said it didn't matter. It was more important to, quote, give witness than engage in, quote, perfectionism. As long as the church was willing to accept that ambiguity, Hershberger and the work of Hershberger and his committee seemed successful. In 1956, they had signed agreements with 6 major international unions and many, many local unions. Unions were happy enough with the arrangement that in 1954, Labor Chief Walter Reuther sent out a memo to CIO-related unions directing them to cooperate with the Mennonites. And he gave Hershberger, the great Reuther brother, okay. And it was a good deal. And they cut these deals. Many of you, of course, I have to talk about this, immediately thought, what about other Mennonite groups? The Brethren in Christ were part of his committee, and he worked closely with Brethren in Christ leaders. He seemed to have largely won the support of Mennonites east of the Mississippi. There's evidence he spoke for GCs. Now, GC Mennonites here on the Southern Plains were distant enough from the labor struggle that they never did pass a church-wide resolution on union membership. But their general agreement with much of what Hershberger was doing was perhaps suggested by a comment in 1957 by the progressive GC activist Elmer Ediger, who suggested to the General Conference's Social Concerns Committee that, quote, there must be a better way of outside labor organization. There must be a better way than outside labor organization and an importation of many of its tactics and attitudes. I mean, GC Mennonites were rural folks as well, and organized labor was a foreign body, a foreign concept. And that comment that Ediger made emerged out of an increasing dialogue between Kansas Mennonites and management representatives at the Heston Manufacturing Company. And this dialogue ultimately resulted in the creation, partly assisted by Hershberger, of an official, quote, workers' association, which was certified by the National Labor Relations Board, that Steve Nolt and Roy Lowen recently summarized, that it will practically amounted, said Lowen and Nolt, to, quote, a Mennonite union. All right, that's what we had at Heston. All right? Now, the fact that Hershberger helped midwife the Heston Agreement reflects a broadening of his thought in the 1950s on matters of Mennonites and social responsibility. And here's actually the point, Jim Yunke, you asked last night, and I have it here in my third lecture. Hershberger was increasingly aware of some unhappiness among GC Mennonites with his stricter two-kingdom dichotomies in war, peace, and armed resistance. At a conference in Laurelville, Pennsylvania in 1951, he recognized that Mennonites were dealing with a different kind of state than their Anabaptist ancestors did. It wasn't interested in putting them to death in large numbers. And it was now a state that performed many functions just beyond merely bearing the sword. And actually, some of those functions, Hershberger conceded, were good and useful ones. And the old rigid divide between the church and the world, he began to suggest, might be softening. And this further ferment in his thought was best seen in his next and last major statement on Mennonite social ethics, his important book, The Way of the Cross in Human Relations, which was published in 1958. And that still adhered strongly to some variant of two-kingdom theology, and he still held on to that prized phrasing that Mennonites should do but not demand justice. In The Way of the Cross, 1958, he suddenly began to move away from themes of isolation, withdrawal, and an apolitical Mennonite orientation. And he clearly was pushing Mennonites towards a more active engagement with outside society and to their periodic duty, which he now began, I was talking about this morning in this room at 11, to issue a prophetic call to the social order. So Hershberger clearly was in transformation, was in transition, though I don't know if he ever admitted it. Even so, in the further evolution of his thought, Hershberger expressed views that were at once more flexible and more rigid towards unions. Under his guidance, the Committee on Economic Social Relations recognized that, quote, unions serve a useful purpose for the maintenance of justice and balance in a sub-Christian society, unquote, and they now permitted a Mennonite employee provisional involvement with unions, quote, insofar as doing so does not conflict with his Christian testimony, right? You can be involved with unions as long as it doesn't conflict with your Christian testimony. So on one hand, there's a more softening of the stance. On the other hand, Hershberger revealed his limited use for unions as a public backlash built against them, beginning with the massive strike wave, the largest strike wave in American history in 1946 during the war. There were hundreds of strikes, massive strikes, and that occasioned a large backlash against organized labor. You remember then, of course, that was the last time before the Clinton years when Republicans took a majority in the House of Representatives. And the next year, in 1946, a new Republican Congress passed the Taft-Hartley Act over President Truman's veto. And among other measures, the Taft-Hartley Act legitimated the open shop, which is to say it allowed workers in a plant to remain employed there while rejecting union membership. And you read histories of American labor, and over again, there's compelling evidence and clear analysis that Taft-Hartley was a devastating blow to organized labor. Whole sections of the country, principally the South and Southwest, quickly passed right-to-work laws, and banned union-only shops. And, I've been writing on Mennonites, but I took a time out, and I wrote a book on deindustrialization of the American Midwest. I wrote a book on the effort to close Lima's refinery. I just said I needed to do something besides be a Mennonite historian. And, I spent a lot of time looking at the deindustrialization of the Midwest, and there's no doubt that Taft-Hartley helped facilitate that, right? Jobs went south to right-to-work states. Of course, now Michigan is a right-to-work state, so things have changed, but it helped facilitate deindustrialization. For people more interested in preserving an individual's prerogative in the workplace than in preserving unions, the open shop amounted to a stunning advance of personal freedom. And Hershberger thought it was a wonderful development, Taft-Hartley. In The Way of the Cross, in Human Relations, he said the closed shop was, quote, a form of totalitarianism, he said. And more Taft-Hartley legislation, right-to-work laws in more states, he wrote, would allow the individual Christian to, quote, be more free to choose the way his conscience directs him, thus pushing labor to, quote, to operate on a higher ethical level. And for all his abhorrence of coercion, and it was sincere, he abhorred coercion, Hershberger was also open to harnessing it in Mennonite labor relations. At various points, he considered asking the federal government to pass legislation that would have required unions to respect Mennonite neutrality, to pass legislation forcing them. Now, he did not do this in '53, though he admitted that, quote, I am closer to that position than I used to be. But in 1965, he did appear before a congressional subcommittee and recommend that legislation, right? And the reason that Hershberger was increasingly encountering these ethical ambiguities was that, to his credit, he was attempting to adapt two-kingdom theology that Mennonites had adopted in isolation to a new day when that social distance was disintegrating. And if this point escaped him, he was reminded of it in 1958 by a fellow member of the Goshen faculty, someone in the religion department. Quote, "The basis of understanding the labor movement," wrote the young Goshen ethicist J. Lawrence Burkholder in his dissertation, quote, "is typical of a general, unwritten, and more or less unconscious agreement between Mennonites and the worldly powers, according to which Mennonites will do little or nothing to disturb the equilibrium of social and political forces, provided they are given the privileges of living a quiet and godly life in isolation." That was part of Lawrence Burkholder's critique. As that isolation lessened, there were other models of peace church Christian social responsibility available. And by 1952, Hershberger was working closely with someone who could apprise him of those alternatives. That is, he was working closely with Kermit Eby. I've got to give you some background about Kermit Eby. He is a fascinating character. Most of you are more aware of Hershberger, I suspect, than Kermit Eby. Hershberger came from a peace church rural community, though a Brethren as opposed to Mennonite one. Eby apparently is a Mennonite name, right? I'm sure some of you give me the whole genealogical derivation of it if we had time. He said, "I would be a Mennonite today," he said in 1961, had not his grandfather told his father, then a young man, when he came courting his daughter, that if you want to win my daughter's hand, you better avoid the unequal yoke and get baptized as a brethren. So I guess Eby's father's love outweighed his commitment to his church, and he became a brethren. And Eby was born, raised, and nurtured a farm boy within the patchwork of neighboring Brethren Mennonite farms north of Wakarusa, Indiana, about a dozen miles west of Goshen, all right? And more specifically, his world centered around his family's church, the Balgo Church of the Brethren. And for the rest of his life, Balgo and the cultural values instilled there, personal integrity, faith, deep devotion to individual rights, remained the pole to Eby's compass. Eby, I mean, just wonder, if Eby's grandfather hadn't insisted that, and Eby had been raised in the Mennonite church, maybe his confrontation with Hershberger would have happened at a younger age. But as it was, he went off to the denominational college. He went to Manchester College and was elected a Brethren minister, and then he gravitated towards education. He taught Amish kids in a rural school outside of Goshen, but then their paths diverged. He did a stint of graduate school at the University of Chicago before he accepted a position as a high school history teacher in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the early 1930s. And there he immersed his students in the great problems of the day, the Great Depression and the labor struggle. While he was careful to bring in guest speakers from the left and right to his classes, some of the parents objected to the former and labeled him, quote, that communist teacher. And the smear was effective, and it cost Eby his job, but his education continued apace. He embraced the cause of Christian socialism. He met social workers who took him to meet Ann Arbor's poor, where he described really in stunning detail the texture and smell of wretched poverty there in the depths of the Great Depression. He said it always haunted him. And soon he was joining carloads of activists to drive up to Flint, Michigan, and help in the great sit-down strike, one of the great strikes of American labor history, the sit-down strikes at Flint, Michigan in the winter of '37, where he peeled potatoes in the strike kitchen and soon was walking picket lines. And it was in that context where Eby developed an identity with the labor movement that would shape the rest of his life. He met the Rutherford brothers. He met other major American labor leaders, and most of all, he was deeply immersed in the culture of organized labor there in its height when it was a culture and a movement and a powerful emotional crusade. The culture of radical unionism. I'll quote him here. "I found my religion in the social sense," he said, "and I sung in earnest all the old Union and radical songs which are now reserved for museums." This is the 1950s he's writing. He says, "I like the CIO in its birthing stage, and one of the reasons I liked it is that I am biased towards those people in whom the blood runs high," he said. And he also, in those days, helping with the CIO as it was born in Flint, Michigan, he learned a different lesson than Hershberger about how to apply his sectarian heritage. He discovered, he said later, that, quote, how the rather isolated idealism of the brethren could find expression in organizing the unemployed and actively engaging in politics. That's what his sectarian heritage taught him. Well, his association with the labor movement began in 1937 and continued for the next 15 years as a union organizer and administrator, all of while he remained a Brethren lay minister deeply devoted to his church. His Brethren commitments, prizing as they did things like individual autonomy and sympathy for the underdog, fed a career with organized labor that was sometimes tumultuous. He led the Chicago Teachers Union until he was fired in 1941 for insubordination and battles with the political machine of Chicago, the Kelly Nash political machine. Then he took a job in Washington, D.C. as research director for the CIO, where he lobbied government officials on behalf of labor. He represented the CIO with UNESCO, and he waged periodic smaller battles within the CIO office on behalf of individuals he thought had been wronged by the bureaucracy. He did not function well, as it turns out, in a bureaucracy. And in the end, labor had enough of him, and he broke ties, and he accepted a position teaching social sciences at the University of Chicago, where he remained until his premature death from cancer in 1962. But even as a college professor in Chicago in the 50s, his thoughts and writings repeatedly turned back to unions, which he now expressed in terms of deep disillusionment. He loved the labor movement and its passionate youth, but he was increasingly aghast at its too quick transition to stolid, unimaginative middle age. The Taft-Hartley legislation meant that unions were increasingly forced, summarized as one historian, into a, quote, narrowly focused defensive brand of private sector collective bargaining. And you know, one of the concessions and one of the deals that organized labor cut with big management was they would allow their health benefits to come not as a function of the state, but as a function of private employment. So pretty soon unions were major negotiating agents about things like health care. Imagine if they had insisted in the late 50s they had been a government-run thing. Labor union had become, quote, big labor, internal oligarchies administratively top-heavy with technicians and officials and increasingly parochial in their bargaining strategy and political outlook. And throughout the decade of the 50s, in article after article, E.B. decried that transformation. The union movement is no longer a fellowship of dreamers sharing one big faith and aspiring to a common destiny, he lamented in 1961. Today, big unionism is big business and its power structure resembles that of the corporation, unquote. Well, it was at that point, with those kind of perspectives, that E.B. found himself useful to Hershberger. And in the early 1950s, Hershberger began bringing in E.B. as a consultant with various Mennonite businesses as they sorted through relationships with their employees. And Hershberger was sure that the Mennonites had the requisite theology needed, Theron Schlabach said, but E.B. could provide the, quote, technical expertise that they lacked. And in the process, says Theron, E.B. and Hershberger developed a real friendship. And I don't doubt that was true, but E.B. had his own take on what he was doing. He said, for 3 years, he writes this in 1958, for 3 years I have acted as a consultant for the Mennonite Committee on Economic and Social Relations. My primary assignment is the interpretation of the Mennonite heritage to Mennonites. Ironically, they want my competence as a labor management consultant, exactly what I do not want, he writes. So the Mennonite heritage he gave Mennonites was a radical one of Anabaptist forebears who were communitarians, who were levelers, who valued workers more than property, and whose leader, Menno Simons, denounced the charging of interest. And none of that gave Hershberger pause at all. John Oyer went to University of Chicago and took classes under E.B. and sounded out Hershberger, first of all, whether he should do this. All right? And here's what Hershberger told Oyer. He says, E.B. is not as radical as he once was. He says, 20 years ago, he went into the labor organizing field with evangelistic zeal, thinking to bring Christian justice to the oppressed, unquote. And now those years of the CIO have taught E.B., says Hershberger, that, quote, organized big labor is as dangerous and unchristian as big business. He now admits, frankly, that the real Christian way is the Anabaptist Mennonite Brethren way, which brings employers and employees into one brotherhood, working things together in the way of Christian love. That's what Hershberger thought. And in the way of the cross and human relations, he held up E.B. as example 1A of the formerly naive but now wizened up ex-labor leader, and he quoted his disillusionment with labor at some length. Well, actually, as it turned out, I don't think Hershberger read all of E.B. He was a more complex thinker than that, and I think it would have behooved Hershberger to pay more careful attention. Now, look, that would have taken effort, and I'm not faulting Hershberger. E.B. was a prolific writer. He authored 4 books, over 100 articles in religious journals like the Christian Century and the Christian Scholar, as well as intellectual periodicals like the Progressive and the Humanist, but he did not develop his ideas systematically. The great Brethren historian Donald Durbaugh calls him a, quote, intellectual gadfly. His books were largely autobiographical, and they were more popular than scholarly, and he was an idiosyncratic teacher. He openly admitted to his students that what he taught was, quote, the life and loves of Kermit Eby. But when you take together, I think Kermit Eby's writing ultimately presented a direct and clear challenge to Hershberger's carefully constructed Mennonite answer to the problem of injustice. And Eby's own answer to that problem emanated from the same intellectual base as Hershberger's, his sectarian heritage. A former student said he began every session of the first class by admitting his biases, quote, discussing the basis of his convictions and explaining his political and ethical position. Those biases were sectarian. In fact, they were brethren. Eby's thoughts, like his lectures, would turn soar and wheel, but they would always return like homing pigeons to his childhood home and the Balgo Creek Church, the Brethren. And he had plenty of heroes in that childhood, but one hero stood out among all the rest. His grandfather, patriarchal, red-bearded Monroe Schwam, the pastor of the Balgo Creek congregation, who guided and led his brethren community in the manner of an Old Testament rabbi. Schwam was someone, Eby said, who embodied personal integrity, who taught him as a child his word was his deed, and who demonstrated to him in word and in actuality the values of thrift, hard work, clean fence rows, and the larger responsibility of the community. Now, he did not immerse his child in such nostalgia that he was unable to perceive its faults. Intermingled in these rosy memories were admissions of the gossip and prejudice that community harbored, its emphasis on work as an end in itself, its mindless Puritanism, and its underlying authoritarianism against which the teenage Eby clearly had rebelled. And perhaps it was that lingering rebellion that so fueled his passion against big labor in his older years, especially the way it seems to have let the needs of the larger organization override those of the individual. He treasured memories of, quote, the fierce utopianism of those who built the CIO. They were singing, vital, morally committed men. And he discovered that those previous associations could land him in trouble in the context of McCarthy-era America. In 1953, he was subpoenaed to appear before Senator William Jenner's Senate subcommittee investigating possible communist subversion in the labor movement, and he was eager to appear. He was thrilled he got a subpoena. And this is what he told the Senate committee. He told him that, quote, I have never been and was not now a communist, that I had always, by virtue of long-held conviction, been an anti-authoritarian, that I belonged to the order of the Brethren by birth and was both a minister and professor by trade, unquote. And he also told Jenner's committee if they wanted to try him, then they needed to try his whole Brethren tradition that had produced him. Try them, he said. Well, the senators were not up for that, so they just kicked them out. But he said, Eby said the church was really at fault for me being there in the first place. He said, I am active in the labor movement less by choice than by accident. If the church was more as militant for the values which concern me most, I'd be working in it instead of the CIO. He said, and of course, Hershberger at that point would have only nodded in agreement. That was his message. But at the same time, Eby refused to accept the easy bifurcation of others from his brethren Mennonite tradition made between the political and coercive world and the supposedly apolitical church. Not long after he plunged into union organizing, he realized that, quote, I love these quotes. He says, he was plunged into union organizing, right? And he says, I realized I took to the same old church in disguise. The sectarians of the left, the Shackmanites, Trotskyites, Lovestoneites, socialists, social democrats, social fascists, were all somehow disturbingly familiar faces from my youth. Where I had seen those faces before? In the inflamed and ecstatic face of the local parson preaching of a Sunday against sin, he says. Politics permeated everything, he told the young idealists in the labor movement. It was, quote, just as natural as breathing. There was politics in every family, every church, every institution, unquote, and especially, he said, in the church. Anybody who insisted on the supposedly apolitical nature of the church would have been dismissed by Eby as inhabiting a fantasy land. He said he lived in the Brethren community long enough to recognize authoritarianism when he saw it. The same secular words even applied. The church elder clearly was the boss. Those who supported him were clearly a caucus. And those below were governed, quote, quite ruthlessly. We would be more honest, he wrote, if we admitted we are political and didn't so often involve God's sanction for doing what our power interests dictate anyway, unquote. Since the realms of church and the world could not be so easily bifurcated. It only followed to Eby that the church's values ought to be applied to society outside its doors. As he made the transition from the Brethren farm into the CIO, he realized that, quote, the peace, the good life, and the ordered society still depended on Brethren values, unquote. And this was, quote, a realistic possibility to the extent that those values were moved into the world of politics and economics. All that idealism, he said, was meaningless unless it was, quote, translated from the day-to-day into specific and concrete action in the political arenas. His years in the labor movement, he wrote, had made him, he admitted in 1958, quote, a hard-bitten person, unwilling to accept that peace would float down like a cloud from heaven. Instead, it would only arrive as a byproduct of the day-to-day political decisions made in ward and precinct. In contrast to Hershberger, Eby made it clear there were better uses for their sectarian commitments than isolating them in a religious preserve where their adherents could simply model Christian love. Over and over, he said, there are no islands left, there's no refuge left, not in the era of the bomb. All right, in the face of that peril, he knew that, quote, the love or agape ethic of my fathers must be universalized. And this, he said, would require sectarian Christians to shake off their inclination to withdraw from the world. Instead, he said that he had to plunge into politics to maintain the common good of all. And this would require, quote, more courage than to withdraw into an island of the like-minded. In fact, he said it required more courage to live conscious of Christ's teachings in the rough and tumble world than in any assembly of saints, right? And Eby's location in this rough and tumble world enabled him, maybe more clearly than Hershberger, to count the cost of their isolation. He pointed out that, quote, the simple honesty and brotherhood that prevailed to a large degree in my home community had failed before the challenge of larger society. He said, brethren have proclaimed peace, but their communities had fattened on war profits, and 9/10 of their young men entered military service in World War II. He said they proclaimed brotherhood, but they had done almost nothing to combat the stark evil of Jim Crow. Well, all right, Hershberger did get this. And he read enough of Eby's writings to know that his earlier confidence in Eby's theological soundness had been misplaced. And he responded to that in the pages of The Way of the Cross and Human Relations. And his disillusionment with big labor, Eby's disillusionment with big labor, Hershberger said, lay in a, quote, confused awareness that however just the cause might be, the coercive methods of organized labor are not in harmony with basic Christian ethic as was understood and taught by his brethren Mennonite forebears. And you know, Eby got under Hershberger's skin because you got to listen to the tones. And this was uncharacteristic of Hershberger. I don't see him very often being condescending or sarcastic. All right, but listen to this. To prove the point, Hershberger turned to Eby's model of his brother and patriarch, Grandfather Schwam, who Eby had dismissed, Hershberger says, as naive. Maybe so, says Hershberger. But Schwam, quote, gave love its rightful priority over justice, as the New Testament also does. No brethren preacher ever had more evangelistic fervor than Eby has himself. The difference lies in the content of the gospel which is preached. For once Eby found himself marching on the road of organized labor with justice as his goal, the vision of the higher law of love became obscured. Now, Eby seemed to grasp this truth, said Hershberger, in his, quote, undisguised wistful nostalgia for a more pristine economy based on Christian brotherhood. But when Eby finally faced conditions of, quote, actual conflict, methods of power apparently continued to take precedence over the way of the cross, so that one also might ask in all seriousness whether or not it is Grandfather Schwam red beard and other superficial accoutrements which the nostalgic Eby has grasped rather than the basic principles for which the grandfather stood. You don't hear Hershberger being condescending or sarcastic. Well, Eby responded. And he responded when he was asked to review The Way of the Cross in the pages of the Christian Century, in 1958. And the review was called Square with the World. All right? In the Mennonite world, which nurtured Guy Hershberger and myself, he began, the big red barn was the central point of the farm scene. Before the barn could be built, it had to be laid out. Before it could be laid out, the foundation had to be built. And the foundations had to be sturdy and above all square with the world, unquote. That was just the way barns had to be. Quote, Guy Hershberger's book is like that barn, Eby said, well laid out and squared with the world. There was not, he said, a shade of gray or doubt on its pages. Its course is, quote, almost exactly between Niebuhr's neo-orthodoxy to the north and Rauschenbusch's Christian action to the south. Sometimes, he said, it veered more toward one pole or the other, but, quote, never for long. Readers can proceed through its pages in confident assurance of God's ultimate victory. Yet in reality, E.B. said, quote, having lived through many barn buildings laid out square with the world, unquote, the actual construction process is not as smooth. Disagreements crop up all along. Where will the windows go? Will the barn be painted all red or trimmed with white? Will the horses be stabled on the north or south end? In other words, he said, quote, it's with the internal layout that the trouble begins. Not all of us are Mennonites, and not all of us have the same blueprints, unquote. Indeed, he said, quote, it is this very assurance of direction and destiny which makes Mennonites a bit difficult to work with, he says. On the face of it, he said, Hershberger's ethical construct appeared as solid and square as any Pennsylvania Dutch barn, but its neat and broad frame masked a number of structural ambiguities. Take, for instance, the crystal firmness outlined in the book about pacifism. Of course, Mennonites don't participate in war, quote, but what they do as taxpayers and incidental beneficiaries of the war economy isn't so clear, he said. I am not as sure as Hershberger seems to be that one can steer a clear path between one serves the state and rejects it when one is the beneficiary of the economy and a victim, unquote. And of course, he said he disagreed completely with Hershberger's portrayal of the labor movement. It was not his experience, he said, that the movement hindered the free expression of conscience. On the contrary, the thrust of Hershberger's analysis, quote, leads to individualism and right to work laws. And finally, he said, what about a willingness to advocate for justice for those beyond the church? Ultimately, E.B. admitted he, quote, would have felt more kindly towards this book had it held out more hope for those outside the heritage, unquote. Now that was seemed to be to bookend the exchange. He didn't get invited anymore by Hershberger to work in consultations. And look, E.B. wrote one more book before he was consumed by cancer. Hershberger increasingly turned his attention to the emerging civil rights struggle, where he led the way, by the way, in Mennonites confronting that evil. I mean, he did. So the dialogue between those two men seemed to have ended, and we only might ask what relevance it holds for us today. We've come a long way since the days when Hershberger's unmodified two-kingdom precepts functioned as a satisfactory answer to the problem of injustice, at least for many of us. A number of scholars have documented how a Mennonite concern for justice emerged from the acculturation process to full blossom in the later 20th century. And this paradigm shift emanated from a number of developments. The walls came down, and they came up with a whole new understanding of what it meant to say Christ is Lord. And again, Hershberger was leading the way there. And Mennonites, out of that transition, had a new responsibility to witness to the state. That was something I talked about this morning, and a number of scholars have outlined that process. And the Mennonites, of course, soon recognized that peace and justice were inextricably linked, and you could not have one without the other. Peace and justice went together. And clearly, it dominated the last half-century of Mennonite social ethics. But a parallel Mennonite effort to speak directly to economic justice, disconnected to peace concerns, has been missing. And in part, this may emanate from our own, again, social position. Janice Thiessen, who teaches at the University of Winnipeg, has outlined the relation between Mennonite class position and their attitude towards unions. Her book came out last spring called Not Talking Union, and looked at Mennonites in the union drives in both Canada and the United States. And she says, because Mennonites now make their living in white-collar as opposed to blue-collar occupation, means that only about 6% of Mennonites across North America held union membership. Now, the official church teaching against organized labor delivered by people like Hershberger in the United States and John Redekop in Canada, and that's dissipated. The sociological surveys of church membership profiles of 1972, 1989, and 2007, they didn't even ask about Mennonite attitudes towards unions. And today, Mennonite attitudes towards unions oscillate between dismissal and neglect. We just don't think about them that often. And this, Janice Thiessen ascribes this to a basic underlying pervasive Mennonite individualism that reflects a fundamental shift in the locus of religious authority from the larger community to personal and familial wants and needs. As a result, Mennonites, by virtue of their class position and religious inclinations, once again find themselves on the sidelines of a critically important debate in American society today. What to do about the massive wealth inequalities that have emerged and how we might mitigate the harm that they are inflicting on the common good. I have focused this evening on Mennonites and unions in these lectures because that's perhaps the major arena in which they consider matters of social class. And so the decline of unions today presents some profound costs, I think, that Mennonites ought to consider. Besides providing basic positive effects in American workplaces, increased rates of worker skill, job stability, and productivity, union labor also helped ensure the supply of $20 an hour jobs, the kind of jobs that funded school levies and facilitated high rates of home ownership and helped build stable working class communities. The decline of those kinds of jobs in contemporary America has had a host of negative social effects that sociologists like Robert Putnam have documented in detail. Putnam and his crew of researchers have highlighted the kind of penalties that the existence of this second America that I talked about last night, the second America, less educated, poorer, socially and physically disconnected from the rest of us, the cost that second America does and will impose. Not only is, quote, writing off such a large fraction of our youth an awfully expensive course of inaction, Putnam argues, but, quote, the bleak, socially estranged future facing poor kids in America today undermines our democracy and perhaps even our political stability. It also, and this is, of course, this was published in the spring of 15, all right? Remarkably prescient. It also, he said, violates our deepest religious and moral values. In sum, the Mennonite inability or refusal to engage questions of social class means that we position ourselves to not say much about the ongoing struggle today to protect the good of all. At least we're unlikely to do this through the traditional means by which Americans have tried to safeguard the common good, that is, by grasping the hand of politics. You know, this summer, as I wrote these lectures, I went back and read the most recent Mennonite flap about politics, at least a big enough flap to have been given time in a church-wide conference meeting. This was occasioned in 2004 in which John Roth, my friend John, tremendous guy, tremendous scholar, tremendous leader of the church. John Roth, you remembered, called for a self-imposed Mennonite hiatus from political wrangling in the heat of that presidential campaign. And you think back 2004, it's almost like he issued that call in a world of Victorian simplicity compared to today, right? We shouldn't vote. John, I mean, you know, it's not his fault. I mean, you think about where we are now, the names we called each other back then. I have binders full of women, says Mitt Romney. You think that was an insult? I mean, yeah, I want to see insults. Come to 2016. Now, John qualified this appeal carefully, and John was not calling for withdrawal. He was on and on with passionate appeals for Mennonite engagement with their society in other ways. But at least Roth's call prodded American Mennonites to think critically and reflectively again about how they might pursue a social responsibility in the political sphere. And the nature of our history, with all its consideration of two kingdoms versus one, its tendency to consider justice mostly in the context of peacemaking, its prizing of prophetic witness to the state, has perhaps limited our ability to speak to the uses of politics in other ways. Lawrence Burkholder put his finger right on this matter in 1994 in a cogent little critique of Yoder's Politics of Jesus. Quote, Yoder, while making a place for witness, makes no place, he said, for real earthly kingship or its modern democratic equivalent, unquote. It's permissible now for us to speak in the political realm, he said, and certainly to witness, but, quote, not to govern. And now that our isolation and pretended innocence is no more, Burkholder recognized a quarter century ago, quote, what is called for is a Mennonite ethic that will justify in theory what is generally accepted in practice, that engages honestly the relativity of a complex reality. It means the end of innocence and the beginning of a vast and troublesome quest for places to draw the line short of pure non-resistance, unquote. Maybe Mennonite, now I'm speaking here now, not for Burkholder, I'm speaking for me. Maybe Mennonite political hesitancy emanates at bottom from an illusory bifurcation we insist on maintaining between our political and our economic lives. The walls we erected to maintain that dichotomy have all come down. They're all down. And whether or not we physically press the lever at the ballot box, we vote every time we buy a pair of shoes or a loaf of bread. This does not necessarily mean, of course, that we have to follow the thinking of Reinhold Niebuhr to its ultimate conclusion and pick up the gun. A consideration of political involvement does not necessarily force us into an all-or-nothing set of choices. Voices of our own have been telling us this for years. With all his Hershberger's worried that politics could suck Mennonites into coercive power, he acknowledged that the modern democratic state provided all sorts of necessary welfare functions that did not by nature threaten the Mennonite conscience. He conceded that Mennonites could function as minor office holders. 60 years ago, Kermit provided one possible answer to John Ross' plea for sabbatical from voting. Of course, the nature of the American political system presents people of peace with lousy choices. When it comes to presidential elections, he would have said, I mean, these are occasions in which we elect the commander-in-chief of the military. There's no pure choice there. But that doesn't mean that we don't engage in electoral politics. He said, rather than telling our kids that they could someday aspire to be president of the United States, we should just tell them they could someday aspire to be precinct captains, he said. Thus, we stand at an important juncture in Anabaptist history, wrote the Mennonite economist James Halteman 20 years ago. How high should the wall between the two kingdoms be? Will the community of faith become secularized if the wall is reduced or torn down altogether? Is pacifism the only remaining mortar in holding the wall together? These questions are difficult to answer, Halteman admitted, but it seems clear that the weakest spot in the wall is in the area of economic relationships. And he laid out a continuum, he said, which seemed to set the parameters for Protestant political and economic engagement in modern America. One end of the continuum he called the modelers, with which he identified Anabaptism. It's the Christian's job, we Anabaptists supposedly argue, only to present a different model for society and to call people into it and out of the sinful order. The other pole in Halteman's continuum was what he called the infiltrators, which he identified with Reformed tradition, and he said that their approach to social change was to penetrate wider society and pull it toward kingdom values. Well, I think that's a useful analysis as long as we reject his equation of the infiltrators only with the Reformed tradition. The larger Anabaptist family tree, extending from Reformation Europe to our own day, harbors more than a few of these infiltrators as well, who mapped out the same approach and promised the same fruitful results. In 1959, 3 years before his death, E.B. sat at a Brethren conference in Des Moines, Iowa for 3 days, listening to all these lovely, heartfelt testimonies about the power of Christian love. And finally he had enough, and he rose to speak. He confessed that it all made him tired listening to all this stuff. He said, love, quote, is only half the heritage. The other is the struggle for justice. Justice is the arithmetic of love. It is only when love is spelled out that the tension develops. We can love as much as we wish. It is only when we challenge the incumbent power structures that the cross emerges. In conclusion, friends, I think it's by recapturing these nuts and bolts, this arithmetic of love, that we Mennonites can reinforce our commitment to the common good, though it means we act in intensely political ways. Sometimes even doing simple works of service involve us inherently in politics. What do we do that's not political? Insisting on this kind of arithmetic and refusing to concede terms like relevance and responsibility to the Nebrians might be part of our social responsibility now that the walls with outside society have come down. It's not the only way we can contribute to the common good, but it is one way. Thank you all very much. I'm sure you have questions for me now. Thank you. It's been great to be here.
What kind of relationship did E.B. maintain during his time, particularly at the University of Chicago, with the Church of the Brethren?
They treasured him, from all I can tell, as a Brethren lay minister. He performed weddings. He went around and did supply preaching. Look, Marvin, I don't doubt that relationship was problematic. You can't say the stuff he was saying. And he was, and I mean, you don't have to see my footnotes. The title of one of his books, I'm quoting, was For Brethren Only. I mean, these were books aimed at the Brethren community. I mean, on one hand, so deeply rooted in his deep love for the Brethren heritage. But on the other hand, you know, he's calling them bosses and caucus leaders and authoritarians. And I don't doubt it was problematic. But they treasured him until he died. Brethren ministers came to him on his deathbed as he died painfully of cancer in a hospital. He's buried in the Balgo Church of Brethren Cemetery, north of Wakarusa. I suspect it was a problematic, but a relationship that unfolded still in love.
I find myself struggling with the portrayal of rural and sectarian as something that would really withstand urban experience in Amsterdam or Strasbourg or even in Prussia. Did you see any evidence of, threads of these kinds of thoughts from within Anabaptist Mennonite experience?
Well, I didn't see it in Eby, and I didn't see it in Hershberger. There were others from the GC tradition at the time who were pointing out that, look, our church was born in an urban environment, and it doesn't mean the end of our commitments. Eby lived for a number of years in Washington, D.C., where he bought the whole Gemeinschaft, the Gesellschaft kind of continuum done in sociology, where he saw the urban environments as leading inherently to decay, which, of course, was the same tradition out of which people like Winfield Fretz wrote and Hershberger himself wrote, right? So, no, I agree, that's a fair critique, and it's a fine rejoinder to him. That didn't seem to be part of his framework. He worried a lot about how Brethren values disintegrate in the cities. Yeah, Stan.
We couldn't talk about it in Bluffton when Flock was organizing migrant labor. And Reedley couldn't talk about it either. My classmates I went to school with, we remained friends, but we couldn't work it out.
Stan's referring to when Baltimore Velasquez was a Bluffton college student. He was an immigrant, undocumented Mexican guy his parents were undocumented. I think he was born in Pandora, wasn't he? Baltimore Velasquez, and in the 1960s was a Bluffton student and organized the Farm Labor Organizing Committee. And at one point, apparently, they marched into Bob Kreider's office, President Kreider's office, and demanded that we were going to boycott Marbeck until you get rid of table grapes in solidarity with the United Farm Workers. And Kreider said, "Good idea. I've already ordered those grapes be removed." But he caught a lot of heat, Bob did, from Mennonite growers in the area who didn't appreciate what Velasquez was doing. Velasquez faculty raised money to send him to King's Poor People's March, where he learned a lot about nonviolence. He married Sarah Templin Velasquez. He married Lawrence Templin's daughter. And he still apparently prizes his association with Bluffton. Now, your interaction with him, Stan, would have come at a very difficult time. I mean, he speaks now and then back on campus. I mean, he speaks very fondly of his alma mater. And have you read Janice's book? Janice T. Well, you're a character in it. She's poked through your papers. And actually, Stan, don't lose sleep. You come off pretty well in her book. And there were others. Oh, Hershberger responded very negatively to the United Farm Workers. And I mean, okay, he was a product of his time. I'm not condemning him, but it's coercion. We can't be involved in it. It's coercion. And he was certainly a vigorous advocate for racial justice. But in that instance, well, he comes under critique. And you would have seen that. You would have, in your world, as in Bluffton, and then later here, and the Peace and Social Concerns Committee would have been caught up in those struggles, certainly. And you couldn't talk about it. Yeah. Kreider, I think, had a hard time. What do you do? Those are big contributors to the college, and they're mad. And they were saying, crack down on this kid. The world of Mennonite college presidents, God help them all. No, it's a tough, you think it's a tough job.
Just a comment here. is that the place that we need to re-examine, that, Brethren values disintegrate in the city, or the only way values are preserved is to have a Mennonite college or a Mennonite high school, as you've mentioned before. If we follow your urge to engage politically, maybe that is a kernel that needs to be.
Well, I agree. That's not my continuum, Gemeinschaft, the Gesellschaft. I was born and raised in L.A., right, and encountered Mennonites in grad school in Pittsburgh. And I think we're a long way from that Mennonite community flowered and then withered on the vine, the whole Mennonite community movement. And geez, some of those, of course, this speaks on my own social position, some of the most vital, active, engaging Anabaptist communities I know are Mennonite churches in the cities today, right? There's some of the most important work in Lorraine Avenue here in Wichita, and I used to attend Hyattsville Mennonite Church. And, yeah, but okay, I'm reflecting my own biases here, I'm sure, I guess. Right? Thank you.
In
Hi, Harv.
today's society, is there general agreement on what the common good is, or are there multiple common goods?
There's a billion common goods. I mean, we'll find out which one temporarily prevails next Tuesday, right? And whether we'll build a wall, right? Whether our idea of common good is explicitly race-based, or whether it's more inclusive. This dialogue will continue, right? Maybe amid the disintegrating fragments of both major American political parties, right? Or at least one. So we'll see what happens. But Harv, we live in an incredibly diverse society, and I think Donald Trump's campaign will founder on that diversity. I don't think you can, we'll see, I don't think you can say the kind of things he's saying and be elected to president. I don't think you can do that. But we'll see whether the voters agree next Tuesday.
I have a question here, Perry.
Yes, Dorothy. This is my old pastor here, by the way.
Not your old pastor.
My former pastor.
Do you know, Perry, how the Amish have reconciled moving to the industrial work in Elkhart County, for instance, where and what that relation is then with the labor movement per se, or how they have squared the two kingdom theology, communitarian life, but then separation, and yet working massively in blue collar and industrial settings.
Look, Dorothy, I am determinedly not an Amish scholar. I've learned that is a whole flourishing and powerful academic subfield. I mean, they just had a major conference at, was it Lancaster or Elizabethtown last spring? Same time Mark and I were at Grable on Mennonite Peace Building. I mean, there's just boatloads of impressive. Don Crable led, and John Hostetler long ago led the way, and this is the Amish studies people are powerful. I have not been part of that dialogue. I mean, I can just speak anecdotally. You're right that they are making farmland, the price of farmland. Man, what is it here in southern Kansas? It's an incredibly escalating bubble in Northwest Ohio. I know at least that. And farmlands that sell for $10,000, $12,000, $15,000 an acre, Northwest Ohio. So you want to make a living at farming, you want to make a living. If you're Amish, you got to turn this other way. And I don't know how they're navigating that tension. Lawrence Matthews, who you would have known, is now deeply involved with the Mennonite Disaster Service Unit in Detroit, and they're getting lots and lots of Amish farm people, Amish people, up to work Mennonite Disaster Service in Detroit, where apparently they're singing four-part harmony in African-American churches downtown Detroit and charming people. Right? But I can't, Dorothy, I can't even answer that. It's not my field.
Perry, you brought up the presidential race again, and I wanted to bug you about one thing you said last night.
Yes.
Where you indicated that you thought Trump supporters were by and large less educated, working class whites. But I just read an article in Time magazine or New York Times, I don't remember where I read it, but saying that we middle-class whites like to portray Trump as a product of working class and non-educated whites, but his support is huge among among college-educated white men.
Yeah. I mean, I'm engaging in huge sweeping generalities, and clearly what we're all reading is popular journalism because the social scientists haven't been working through this. I mean, I have citations for that, and there are articles in the Atlantic, and there are articles in the New York Times. Clinton seems poised to get a much higher percentage of college-educated white vote than Romney did, which is historically, people with bachelor's degrees have historically, those of us with PhDs tend to be left of center, but people with bachelor's degrees tend to, she's poised to get more of that, but that doesn't mean that she's getting it all. Huge numbers of whites with bachelor's degrees are going to vote for Trump. You're right, and yeah, I'm painting with a pretty broad brush. But there is also lots of evidence about the fact that fairly numbers of, what has he admitted? I love the poorly educated, he says, right? And look, I bicycle all across Allen, Putnam, and Hancock counties all the time, and our county is laden with Trump signs. I mean, they are everywhere in rural Ohio, everywhere. And they're not all in front. I mean, they're in front of nice homes, right? I mean, just visually. They don't look like poor people to me with those. Yeah, I agree. And I think that's a fine corrective. Those people are resonating with what Trump is saying, and we'll spend a while, Republicans in particular are going to spend a while figuring out why that is. I mean, whatever happens, I mean, that's a major moment of soul searching for the Republican Party. I mean, I'm not a political scientist here, but I mean, that's a train wreck for them. It's a train wreck. Well, they know that the largest single voting bloc, the fastest growing racial bloc is Latino voters, and they've alienated them now for generations. They knew it in 2012, and they talked about how to fix it. Well, look what happened, right? And they know. They're interested in survival. They know. So we'll see what they do. I don't know what will happen. It partly depends on what happens next Tuesday. Yes, sir.
I'm not particularly good at crafting questions, but
No,
I'd like
it's
to
fine.
try.
No, it's good. Please.
The relationship between Anabaptists and the working class these days, in many ways, I didn't understand the Trump movement at all until NPR reported one day that the Democratic Party used to be the voice of the working people.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And they made the suggestion that it now has become much more the voice of professional people.
Yep, absolutely it has.
So my question is somewhere in the area of what's the Anabaptist message toward the working class people these days?
No, I think
our own and the Trump supporters.
No, I agree. We've got to think. There's a book. Allison Hebert was just telling me about this yesterday. It's a book I need to read. Who's this? What's this guy's Allison? What's this guy's name? Hillbilly Elegy? What's that? Yeah, J.D. Vance, right? Who comes out of profound rural poverty where the opioid epidemic is sweeping like a scythe, right? And goes off of the Marine Corps and credits the Marine Corps for. I just read reviews, right? And no, I agree 100% that if we're going to talk about social class and social justice, we've got to figure out. These people are in worlds of pain, many of them. They're not all, right? I agree. But I did refer yesterday to the remarkable new demographic stuff that's talking about rural, the death rates, increasingly high mortality rates of rural, less educated whites, men and women, through things like opioid epidemics, suicide, alcoholism, lung cancer. Yeah, and that's speaking in many cases out of a deep economic pain that Democrats have largely lost touch with. What was Harry Truman's old comment? If you want to live like a Republican, he said, vote Democrat, right? Well, that's no longer true. You're right. Democrats have become much more the party of wealthy professionals, middle-class professionals, and people of color. And of course, they've cemented that connection now, in part thanks to Trump's comments. I agree. And we're Anabaptists. We care deeply about social justice. We just can't write those people off with any ethnic slur we might ourselves choose to use today, right? And guard our own tongues as we think about those brothers and sisters in Christ who are struggling. Up there, John. Not Mark.
At a World Conference a year or two ago, I listened to the pastor from the Amsterdam Mennonite Church. And it seemed to me like he had no problem stepping into these issues of common good and politics and whatnot in the Dutch society. Do you know anything about how European Mennonites have been responding to these issues? Have they been doing it quite differently than us?
You know, forgive me, I'm going to duck that one. I don't have any special insight. I was in Ukraine, southeast Ukraine, for 5 months, in Zaporizhia, actually teaching at Zaporizhia National University on a Fulbright 4 years ago. So I can give you some insight into Ukrainian affairs. But I've never been to Amsterdam, and that's not my field. And I wasn't at World Conference. I was at Kansas City, and I was at Phoenix, but I wasn't at World Conference. So honestly, I just don't want to waste your time. Others would, though, here, I'm sure, have better insights than I would on that. Here's the mic. It's coming.
I'm thinking back to the background out of which Hershberger and his kind came out of. And my question has to do with what the role of authoritarianism was in the earlier Anabaptist communities. I'm just thinking about Hershberger as he gradually shed his plain coat and began appearing with a suit and tie.
Yeah.
And the whole notion of regulation and authoritarianism, that's the background I come out of, and having seen the contrast between Hershberger and Burkholder, and I heard I had them both for teachers at Goshen.
Oh, you did.
And
wow.
it was a very interesting thing to see the loosening of that, and
Yeah.
how does would you just comment on that a bit, please?
Well, we've entered into a much more egalitarian age, in part because of those authoritarian patterns. Again, I go to what was once a GC church, but I live most of my engagement with Mennonites. I joined First Mennonite Church in 1994 when I arrived in town, and I was 33 then, 34. And you all have a much longer history of these issues than I do. I don't know what that was expressed like here in the Southern Plains in the GC world. My sense is the MMC world, where you're from, was certainly that. And I interviewed at some point, I spent time in Lancaster interviewing people there for my first book, and interviewed a guy named Paul G. Landis. You ever know Paul Landis? A Lancaster bishop, younger guy, who was a bishop at a young age. And he said, when I was a kid, the plain coat wasn't required. It was a symbol of a new birth. It was what you came out of the revivals wearing. But it wasn't legislated, right? And over, it was legislated, and pretty soon the rule book got so thick it went over the cliff. And he said as a bishop, he was confronted over and over again by Lancaster pastors who said, I've got a collection of wonderful Mennonite women in my congregation, teenage girls who desperately want to be baptized, but they've cut their hair. They look like beetles. Do I not baptize them? Do we lose them to the church? And Landis said, no, you have to baptize them. And that's when it was, we do things. Lay resistance. You just gang up on the preacher and you do it, right? That's apparently what happened in the MC church, and that was one of the boundary maintenance mechanisms that they tried to do, right? And in the end, they couldn't do it. You know better. What am I? Some guy from L.A., who read this stuff. You know when they quit wearing those prayer coverings, at least some of them, though I still see some. Where are those folks in the Lima Mall who wear dressed plain. They're not from the Pike congregation, Harvey. No, it's Pike. I preached at Pike, so they can't be from Pike. Let me in there, to preach. Where are they? From some plain dressing Mennonite congregation out, near Elida. But yeah, obviously it's not over. But yeah, I think those patterns broke down in part because of the strong authoritarian patterns. I was talking about this with one of you. My brother teaches Bible at Christopher Dock. He and I are the family of Mennonites. And he said that in John E. Lapp's old church, Plains Mennonite Church, now again, this is anecdotal, I didn't ever witness this, but you can blame him if this is wrong, okay, I'll tell him, that for years after the pastor gave a sermon, the pastor sat down and they invited anyone from our congregation to say anything about that sermon. And John E. Lapp, who I never met, I of course know John A. Lapp, right? But my sense is he wasn't one of these, heavy hitters. He exercised the hand of authority somewhat lightly. Apparently a very gentle man. But even so, the reaction against his manner of leadership in Plains was so intense that years afterwards, according to my kid brother, this is what you did. Now, that would have been an MC thing rather than a GC thing, I think, right? None of that ever existed around here. You guys weren't together enough to pull that off. You're all congregational and everything, right? So, yeah, in the first place, yeah. That's why Henry, Henry, by the way, I was asked at Goshen, why was Henry, I talked about C. Henry up there, and they were very interested. They really were. It was really a delight to be there at Goshen talking about C. Henry Smith. And they asked, well, why didn't he join? Why wasn't he at the 1935 conference? Why wasn't he part of these big Mennonite peace gatherings? I said, because he didn't possess the denominational platform. He wasn't a member of the GC Church until 1941, when he finally joined First Mennonite of Bluffton, my church. He wasn't a GC Mennonite. He was a member of the Central Conference of Illinois. Anyway, long rambling answer, I apologize. You all are tired, and apparently there's a lovely reception waiting for us, but I do want to see if there's any more questions. I'm enjoying being with you all. This has been so rich for me to be here, and I want to thank you all again. What a marvelous, engaged academic community here, all these professors and retired professors and pastors and preachers and social workers and administrators. I am so impressed here in the Southern Plains with this community. Thank you.
Let's thank Perry one more time, and then I have a couple of announcements.
Thank you all. Thank you all. It was good.
So as you've already heard, there are refreshments and a book table out there, so we still have time to mingle, to talk, to ask Perry individual questions. I also want to invite you back next year. This is your advance notice for next year's Menno Simons lectures, which will be given by Professor Emeritus Timothy Wengert from the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. He was a member of the Mennonite Lutheran Task Force, Mennonite World Conference, and Lutheran World Federation that worked together and produced a statement in 2010 about Mennonite Lutheran relations. So he worked on that committee. He knows this well, and he's coming kind of to honor the 500th anniversary of the Reformation next year. He is, however, in high demand. So he said, well, Reformation Day, that's a special day for Lutherans. We'd really like to have you here then. And that was long ago booked for him. So next year he'll be here, but it will be October 8 and 9. That's an unusual time. So you'll have to just look for those announcements when they come out. But now let's go out and enjoy the refreshments and mingle a bit.